Welcome to this conversation that I'm going to have with Ted Shaw, a civil rights advocate today and in the past. We're going to talk about civil rights now and civil rights history. So, Ted, I really appreciate you joining me for this teach out. Thank you.
Well, I'm honored to join you.
So you've then been involved in the world of civil rights, as you said at the beginning, your entire career as a lawyer. And so I want to shift over to the present and ask you how things are the same and different right now than they have been over that period of years you just described. So we're in the Trump administration, not just federally, but all over the country. What are the current really top civil rights issues that people, in your view, should be working on and worrying about?
Well, this administration, the Trump administration, is, as the Reagan administration was, and frankly, as the Bush administrations tended to be, although they look better in hindsight now in light of this Trump administration. But, there have been struggles trying to get the federal government to enforce civil rights laws. And just to make clear that this is not about partisanship, although partisanship has an impact on it. It's not that I always love Democrats, and we have to push, we meaning civil rights lawyers, we have to push Democratic administrations to enforce civil rights statutes when they're in also. But this administration is particularly troublesome and problematic, and those are really understatements. They are dismantling the federal apparatus when it comes to school desegregation in many ways. And I could talk in great detail about education, housing. We can talk about voting rights in particular, hugely important. And their views on the criminal justice system. This is a difficult time, but this is not only about the traditional African American agenda of civil rights issues. We're also talking about Latinos. We're talking about civil rights as it impacts, migration or immigration. We're talking about civil rights as it impacts, religious groups, and in particular, Muslims. There's a great deal of discrimination that's being perpetuated by the federal government right now when it comes to people who are Muslims through its immigration policies. And at the same time, we're seeing, a retreat on the issues that the Black Lives Matter movement picked up on with respect to the use of force against African Americans and against Latinos, for that matter, by police departments. So this is a difficult time. This is an administration that in many ways does not have a civil rights agenda other than to dismantle a great deal of civil rights enforcement.
So let's take criminal justice, for example, because that's one of the issues you were just talking about. So if we're talking about police violence against people of color, does it feel to you like things are worse now than they've been? I don't mean at the very peak in the past, but are they worse now than, say, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s? Or is it just that we're not making the progress you wished that we could be making?
That's always a difficult kind of question to answer because, and I think you recognize it when you said you're not talking about when it was at its peak. But, there's such a long history of police violence against African Americans. And I can remember even in the Clinton administration, when we were pushing the Justice Department under Janet Reno to have the U.S. Attorney's Office pursue certain jurisdictions, certain cities, the New York City Police Department. It was difficult. It was a struggle.
So let me come back to immigration, because it seems to me, It's interesting, right? I also started my career at the Civil Rights Division and particularly focused on police violence and discrimination by police forces. That's where I started as a lawyer. The other part of my practice was especially focused on prisoners' rights in prisons and jails. And that's where I started, and I really have thought of myself as a civil rights lawyer with those as my core activities. But for my own self, recently I've been spending a lot of time thinking about immigration. And I still think of that as civil rights, and it sounds like you do too, but I know why I do, but I want to know, why do you?
Part of the reason that I do it, particularly at this time, is because a lot of what's pushing immigration policy uh, under this occupant of the White House and this administration is, in my view, motivated by discrimination against people because of their race, color, and national origin. And I don't need to go over and over, although I can't stop thinking about these things, the things that that Trump has said and done that make it clear that they are treating people differently and proposing to treat people differently when it comes to immigration, when it comes to their status in this country. Even people who are citizens, and not only citizens, but a federal judge who happens to be of Mexican descent. The way he was treated and talked about, and when a whole group of people on the basis of both ethnicity and national origin are basically being called and treated as if they're thugs and criminals, etc. That's racial discrimination.
Okay, so then last question, I think. Um, if you, the people who participate in this teach out that you're so generously joining with me, what could they be doing if they're interested in civil rights and they want to be doing something? And I don't mean the lawyers, I mean the folks who aren't lawyers.
Yeah, that's so important because while you and I are lawyers, I know that I've learned over the years that uh, lawyers, when they think they're going to lead social movements in their role as lawyers, I've come to say that those movements are doomed to failure. I think it's so important for activists right now, at this time, to work uh, for social and political change, to work for racial and economic justice. There's a movement that is restarting. I think about the fact that we are just a couple of months shy of the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, when he died, he was in the process of this whole movement about racial and economic justice, the Poor People's Campaign. And Reverend William Barber down here in South Carolina is working to revive that. We see not only racial inequality in this country, and we see not only inequality on the basis of national origin or religion, etc. But we also see this economic injustice, which is as stark now as it's been during our time and perhaps during almost any time. And so I hope that activists that they work for social change in the streets. I hope that people vote and put economic pressure on the institutions that are responsible for the failure to address these issues collectively. I just want people to be, in the words that are so common these days, to be woke and to work for change in many ways. it is true that sometimes the best in people becomes most evident. It goes perhaps back to the question that you asked, in spite of the fact that I answered it in a way that might suggest otherwise. But sometimes when people are subjected to the greatest threat, that's when you see their character come to the fore, and we need that right now in this country. We need people to stand up for democratic values, and we need to get people to address this terrible political gulf that has grown, and the gerrymandering on partisan lines that have created scenarios like North Carolina or Wisconsin or other jurisdictions. We need people to believe that Americans, are not people who are in one party. Nobody has one claim to that, and we need to respect the fact that people may disagree, but they still have a place in our polity and in our discourse, and in American values. And so I can go on and on about this, but I hope that people struggle against this time and this era and the danger. I think there's an existential threat to America as we know it. I've been saying it before Trump was even elected, and before he had the nomination, that he posed an existential threat. So I hope people wake up and take responsibility for our country and save it from this existential threat. That's what I hope for.
Thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure talking with you today.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for all that you're doing